I have narrated 4,612 archive files in my career. This is the one I delayed the longest. I have presented thousands of transcripts without hesitation. This record gave me pause. Visual noise flooded the primary monitor. The diagnostic system shrieked. It flagged the incoming sensory fragment as critically degraded. It was unclassifiable data. The quantum chronometric index spun backward. It moved at a dizzying rate. It bypassed the formation of the current galactic Senate. It plunged past the extinction of the precursor empires. It dropped past the cooling of the local star clusters. It hit 1 billion years. It hit 2 billion years. It hit 3.2 billion years. The numbers locked. The visual static on the massive obsidian screen stabilized. It held for a fraction of a second. It was not a cosmic event. It was not a planetary formation. It was not a nebula collapse. It was a horizon line. A vast liquid surface reflected a blinding light source. White particulate matter formed a shoreline. Then the data stream collapsed into static again. The artifact was not a physical object. It was a fragment of code. It was a memory buried at the absolute bottom of a 3-billion-year-old mind. The neural pathway was corrupted. It was nearly illegible. The edges of the memory were frayed by time, but it possessed a distinct structural geometry. Something was hiding in the oldest mind in the universe. The telemetry system attempted to re-engage. The cooling fans in the ceiling roared to life. The temperature in the chamber dropped by 2 degrees. The processors whined. The computational load of reaching that far back into a biological matrix was staggering. The static flickered. A shape emerged from the noise. A sound registered on the audio sensors. It was a rhythmic vibration. It was a low-frequency hum. It did not belong there. Nothing about this data belonged there. The Thessari neural translation matrix was designed to handle ancient memories. It was designed to process perfect recall. It was not designed to handle this. The algorithms ripped through the isotopic decay. They tried to find a familiar anchor. They found nothing. The visual output remained a jagged mess. Anomalous sensory input overwhelmed the buffers. The system categorized the liquid surface as an error. It categorized the light source as a hallucination. It tried to purge the file. The fragment refused to be deleted. It sat there. It looped in the system buffer. It was a corrupted ancient ghost. The oldest ghost on galactic record. I watched the playback of this moment 17 times. I watched the numbers stabilize at 3.2 billion. I watched the machine fail to understand what it was seeing. The fragment was an echo. It was unremarkable in its raw data form. Just noise. Just static and a hint of a horizon. But its age made it a leviathan. The chronometric index flashed green. The connection was stable. The retrieval was actually happening. Yesterday, Memory Retrieval Chamber 7 was processing mundane trade dispute records from the 4th era. Today, it held a god. Chamber 7 was a perfect sensory void. The temperature remained at absolute thermal equilibrium. Acoustic baffles swallowed every ambient sound. Dim blue bioluminescence lined the crystalline data walls. The environment was engineered for absolute isolation. No external stimulus could be allowed to contaminate a deep dive. Trainee archivist Sulen Vor adjusted her posture. She was barely 80 cycles old. She was a Thessari, insectoid, 6 arms resting flat on the polished obsidian console. Her compound eyes flickered in rapid succession. She possessed a highly clinical mind. She demanded absolute precision in all things. She liked data that fit into neat, predictable categories. The Galactic Memory Preservation Institute rarely assigned trainees to elder species. It was a strict breach of protocol. But the senior staff had been entirely unprepared. The Orivaan elder designated Talith had suddenly consented. 400 million years of complete silence ended today. 400 million years of refusing all requests for historical cataloging evaporated. A single transmission of assent arrived this morning. No explanation was given. No conditions were set. Vor was the only archivist on duty in the deep wing when the subject arrived. Opposite her floated Talith. Species designation SP-07. An Orivaan. The entity was semi-translucent. It was ethereal. It was a being woven from light and localized gravity rather than carbon and water. Talith was 3.2 billion years old. The entity existed before most planetary crusts in this sector had cooled. The Orivaan did not write down their history. They did not build stone monuments. They did not carve warnings into metal plates. They were the history. Their minds were flawless, perfect crystalline matrices of total recall. The entire Thessari civilization had built its archival system around Orivaan testimony. 2 billion years of galactic history relied entirely on their word. If an Orivaan remembered it, it was absolute historical fact. Vor initiated the secondary telemetry sequence. Orivaan elders never hesitated. Their recall was usually instantaneous. You asked a question. They provided the data. It was a perfect transaction. Talith hesitated. The light within the alien's semi-translucent core flickered. The bioluminescence in the room dimmed. A massive gravitational shift occurred within the entity's center. The temporal index on Vor's console plunged downward again. 1 billion years. 2 billion. 3.2 billion. The absolute limit. The genesis point of Talith's consciousness. Vor watched the entity's core pulse with an erratic rhythm. The machine was pulling the data. The subject was allowing it. But the subject was struggling. Why was a perfect mind struggling with its own origin? The retrieval system engaged deep neural telemetry. The process required absolute environmental mapping. The massive quantum scanners cross-referenced biological memory engrams against known geological and chemical profiles. The algorithm isolated microscopic neurotransmitter echoes. It decoded them back into their original sensory inputs. Photons, chemical signatures, auditory frequencies. Everything was rebuilt from the cellular level up. The corrupted fragment reinitialized on the primary display. It was heavily weathered. 3.2 billion years of constant neural decay had frayed the edges of the data. The visual borders bled into static. The audio track hissed with heavy biological interference. But the core structure held. Light hit a surface. A rhythmic sound vibrated through the chamber speakers. The acoustic baffles struggled to dampen the low frequency. Moisture registered on the atmospheric sensors. Mineral compounds. Organic decay. The telemetry translated the raw data into output. A vast body of liquid dominated the projection. A blinding light source rose slowly over the distant horizon. Symmetrical reflections danced across the water. A shoreline composed of highly regular granular mineral deposits stretched into the foreground. Green photosynthetic organisms clustered in the extreme distance. Vor's upper right hand locked onto the console edge. She ran a geological comparison. The system verified the coordinates against the Orivaan biological index. The diagnostic tool matched the memory against Talith's birthplace. The Orivaan Homeworld has never possessed a liquid ocean. Vor stared at the red text flashing on her secondary monitor. She ran the scan again. She overrode the local cache. She pulled directly from the master server. The result was identical. In 3.2 billion years of exhaustive geological record, the Orivaan planet had never supported surface water. It lacked a blue sky, possessed zero vegetation. The atmosphere was a toxic soup of high-pressure methane and ammonia. The Orivaan evolved in total darkness. They evolved under extreme atmospheric density. The memory currently looping on the screen contradicted the physical reality of Talith's biology. This memory cannot belong to this being. Talith, when describing the memory fragment during the pre-dive calibration, used an Orivaan expression that has no direct translation. The closest equivalent was a complex string of concepts. The warmth before the first thought. Vor had heard this phrase from other elders. She had always assumed it was a poetic metaphor for preconsciousness, an abstract idea of creation. Now she understood. It was literal. Someone had held the Orivaan before they were the Orivaan. Someone had given them warmth. Someone had given them a sunrise. Someone had given them the sound of an ocean. And they had called it a first memory. The physical weight of cognitive dissonance hit Vor. Her spiracles flared. She struggled to draw oxygen into her system. The implications were too massive to process. If this memory was not an organic product of Orivaan evolution, how did it get inside a 3.2 billion-year-old neural pathway? She needed hard data. Vor pulled the environmental parameters from the memory projection. She fed them into the xenobiological databases. She bypassed the standard filters. She ran a raw, unfiltered search across all known chemical compounds. The processors screamed. The results populated instantly. The liquid showed an incredibly high saline content. The mineral granules registered perfectly as silicon dioxide. The green organisms were strictly chlorophyll-based. The light source was undeniably a G-type main sequence star. This specific combination was statistically anomalous. It did not just happen by accident. It existed in exactly one documented planetary system in the current master database. One precise set of coordinates out of billions of surveyed worlds. But Vor did not check the astronomical index yet. She refused to look at the location data. She could not look away from the glowing entity hovering in the center of the dark chamber. The entity that was older than the stars outside the station. She keyed the local translator. Elder Talith. Her voice clicked through the acoustic dampeners. Sounded thin. Weak. The telemetry is registering a severe environmental error. The projection does not match your Homeworld profile. Silence filled the room. The rhythmic sound of the alien ocean continued to play from the speakers. Is this your memory? Vor asked. The ethereal being shifted. Light refracted sharply through its semi-translucent form. Its response did not arrive as spoken words. It manifested as a heavy cascade of fragmented emotional impressions. The Thessari translation matrix struggled to render the archaic syntax. The processing units whined under the intense computational load. Warning lights flashed across Vor's board. The linguistic core was overheating. The translation finally materialized on the screen in block text. It was given. The words hung in the air. Vor stopped breathing. Her primary heart skipped a beat. Before I understood what memory was. By those who made the first songs. The next section of this file is the reason 3 of my colleagues resigned. Archive file 002 documented a signal. A heartbeat woven deep into the galaxy's background radiation. This file documents something entirely different. It is not a broad transmission. It is not a beacon broadcasting to the void. It is a whisper. It was placed directly into the oldest living minds in the universe. It was an intimate surgical intrusion into the very fabric of an emerging consciousness. Vor's lower left arm began to tremble. Her compound eyes dilated. The silence in the room became oppressive. The sound of the ocean waves felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shell. She was an archivist. She preserved the past. But the past she was looking at had been manufactured. She looked at the astrometric database query still pending on her secondary screen. The single match. The coordinates of the planet with a saline ocean, silicon sand, and a yellow sun. She reached out to finalize the search. Her claw hovered over the confirmation key. She did not want to know. But the archive demanded the truth. The obsidian console beneath Sulen Vor's primary hands felt as though it were vibrating with the weight of the pending astronomical query. The flashing cursor on the secondary monitor demanded an execution command. She did not press it. She could not finalize the search for the planetary match until she understood the scale of the anomaly. A single corrupted memory within a single Orivaan elder could theoretically be dismissed as a statistical impossibility. It could be categorized as a spontaneous degradation of the neural matrix. It could be locked away in a secure vault and forgotten by the Thessari archivists. But if it was not an isolated incident, the entire foundation of the Galactic Memory Preservation Institute was in jeopardy. Vor initialized a restricted subroutine designed for catastrophic data verification. Her upper left hand moved across the tactile interface with deliberate, agonizing precision. She bypassed the standard operational safeguards that protected the deep archives. She accessed the central registry directly. This database was incomprehensibly vast. It held the biological and historical profiles of trillions of citizens across thousands of member worlds. She engaged the primary filter parameters. She excluded all species younger than 1 billion cycles. She excluded all carbon-based entities. She isolated the SP07 species designation entirely. The system processed the heavy computational request. Beneath the primary archival node, the subterranean servers hummed with immense power. The massive cooling units engaged overhead. The temperature in the isolated retrieval chamber dropped by a fraction of a degree. The results populated the secondary monitor in rapid succession. 6 names appeared on the glowing display. 6 Orivaan elders. They were the only beings currently in existence with memory layers extending past the 2 billion year mark. They were scattered across the galaxy. Some rested in the deep core worlds. Others drifted in isolated orbital sanctuaries. Vor drafted an emergency request for partial remote telemetry access. She attached a Level 1 priority override code. She dispatched the request through the secure quantum network. She waited. Her mandibles clicked together in a rapid, involuntary rhythm. Her compound eyes remained fixed on the incoming data stream. The silence in Chamber 7 was absolute. It was broken only by the continuous, looping sound of the alien ocean still playing from Talitha's corrupted file. 4 of the 6 elders consented to the remote dive. Vor immediately activated the neural resonance mapping software. This specific diagnostic process was highly intrusive and rarely utilized. Neural resonance mapping does not simply read a memory. It analyzes the physical degradation rate of the synaptic bonds over geological timeframes. The algorithm functions by targeting isotopic decay within the memory core itself. It strips away billions of years of accumulated knowledge, filtering out lived experiences, to find the foundational bedrock of consciousness. It is a process of archaeological excavation conducted within a living mind. The raw telemetry data flooded her console from 4 different sectors of the galaxy simultaneously. Subject 01 processed first. The algorithm drilled down through 2.8 billion years of crystalline memory storage. The oldest fragment stabilized. Vor reviewed the sensory output. Extreme heat, subterranean pressure, the taste of sulfur and raw carbon. It was a perfect, uncorrupted memory of the Orivaan homeworld's thermal vents. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. Subject 02 processed next. The algorithm reached the genesis layer at 2.9 billion years. It flagged a massive environmental anomaly. Vor opened the isolated file. The visual data was entirely absent. The fragment consisted solely of tactile and temperature variations. The telemetry translated the raw biological input into a physical sensation that Vor could comprehend. It was the sensation of atmospheric precipitation. Liquid was falling from a gravitational zenith. It was striking a solid surface in a chaotic, rhythmic pattern. The Orivaan biology registering the memory was expressing profound shock. The temperature of the liquid was freezing. The Orivaan have never experienced rain. Their homeworld lacked the atmospheric density and the thermal dynamics required to produce a liquid cycle. A species that evolved in high-pressure subterranean methane caverns was carrying a foundational memory of standing under a cold downpour. Subject 03 processed. Another severe anomaly triggered the diagnostic alarms. Vor pulled the raw data into the primary viewing matrix. This fragment was purely auditory. It lacked all visual and tactile context. It was the sound of gaseous friction moving rapidly through organic pillars. It was the distinct acoustic signature of wind blowing heavily through a dense forest canopy. The Orivaan homeworld possessed no significant atmosphere capable of generating such wind shear. Furthermore, it possessed absolutely zero organic surface structures. The planet was a sphere of dead rock and toxic gas. Subject 04 processed last. The algorithm reached 3.1 billion years. The anomaly matched Talitha's fragment with terrifying precision. It was the exact same horizon line. It was the exact same body of highly saline liquid reflecting a G-type main sequence star. It was the same granular silicon dioxide shoreline. For elders, separated by billions of years and thousands of light years, carrying the same impossible memory. They were holding sensory impressions of a world none of them had ever visited. A world with blue oceans, green vegetation, and a yellow star. The data was irrefutable. It was not a collective hallucination. It was not a biological malfunction. It was an installation. Talith, when describing the memory fragment during the pre-dive calibration, had used an archaic Orivaan expression that lacked a direct translation. The closest equivalent was a complex string of concepts. The warmth before the first thought. Vor had heard this specific phrase from other elders during her training. She had always assumed it was a poetic metaphor for preconsciousness. She believed it was an abstract philosophical idea regarding the spark of creation. Now she understood the literal truth. Someone had held the Orivaan before they were the Orivaan. Someone had physically interacted with their nascent biological forms. Someone had given them warmth. Someone had given them a sunrise. Someone had given them the sound of an ocean and the feeling of cold rain. And they had called it a first memory. The physical weight of cognitive dissonance hit Vor. Her spiracles flared open. She struggled to draw sufficient oxygen into her system. The implications were too massive to process. The entire Orivaan testimony archive was the bedrock of the Institute. 2 billion years of galactic history had been recorded exclusively through elder memory. The Thessari had built their civilization on the absolute truth of these accounts. If the oldest memories were artificial implants, the foundation was gone. How far up did the implantation go? What else had the Orivaan remembered that was never actually theirs? Did the precursor wars actually happen, or were they simply a narrative installed by an unseen architect? Did the formation of the first hyperlanes occur as recorded, or was it a fabricated history designed to guide the galaxy along a specific path? Her career was entirely meaningless. The Institute's mandate was fundamentally broken. Truth was no longer an absolute metric. It was a variable controlled by a ghost. She turned back to the console. The urgency in her movements escalated. She needed to identify the source. She needed a location. She looked at the astrometric database query still pending on her secondary screen. The single match. The coordinates of the planet with a saline ocean, silicon sand, and a yellow sun. She reached out. She finalized the search. The system confirmed the match with absolute certainty. The planetary designation translated into standard galactic basic. Earth. A planet currently occupied by a relatively young species. They had achieved rudimentary spaceflight only recently. The galactic community considered them entirely unremarkable. They were loud. They were messy. They were confined to their local system. They possessed no advanced technology. They held no significant political power in the Senate. But the math was absolute. Earth's specific environmental profile matched the 3.2 billion-year-old memory with flawless precision. The tectonic history required to form that specific silicon dioxide sand matched. The orbital distance from the G-type star matched. The atmospheric composition required to filter the light into that specific shade of blue matched. The memory was placed in the Orivaan neural structure before the species had developed language. It was placed there before they had civilization, before they had even evolved complex thought. Someone from Earth gave the Orivaan their earliest memory. They didn't just build the galaxy. They built the memories of everyone in it. Vor experienced a profound failure of composure. Her secondary hearts accelerated wildly. To write a memory across species lines requires bypassing the subject's sensory organs entirely. The data must be encoded directly into the neurochemical lattice. It must bond with the host's nascent consciousness before the host even develops the capacity for independent thought. The builders had mastered interstellar travel, yes, but they had also mastered direct biological manipulation. They had written an experience into the cellular structure of a nascent species the way a programmer writes code into a blank drive. She sealed the data package. She encrypted the findings using a heavy cipher. She routed the entire file outside the standard chain of command. She bypassed her superiors. She bypassed the archive director. She directed the transmission to the Galactic Memory Preservation Institute's dedicated Earth liaison office on the capital world. She appended a single request for verification. She did not provide context. She did not explain her methodology. She only sent the isolated sensory data and the astrometric match. Then she waited. 3 local solar cycles passed. Vor remained in the deep wing. She did not sleep. She barely consumed her standard nutrient rations. She sat in the dim blue light of the retrieval chamber. She reviewed the data 1,000 times. She tried to find an error in her methodology. She tried to find a miscalculation in the isotopic decay rates. She ran the environmental simulation backward and forward. She tried to prove the memory was a biological hallucination born of deep space radiation. She wanted the data to be wrong. She needed it to be wrong. But the data held. On the third day, the primary console chimed. A priority transmission arrived from the Earth Liaison Office. Vor opened the file. Contained no text. It contained no official diplomatic response. It lacked any formal explanation from the human government. It was a single audio recording. She routed the playback through the chamber's acoustic dampeners. She amplified the volume to maximum capacity. A low hum. Then the sound of liquid crashing against a solid surface. Ocean waves. The sound filled the silent, perfectly isolated room. Gaseous friction followed. Wind moving over open water. Then, a sharp, rhythmic biological call. Birdsong. It was a raw, unedited acoustic capture from Earth's Pacific coast at sunrise. It was a perfect, flawless match to the silent visual looping in Talitha's ancient mind. The frequency of the crashing waves matched the low-frequency vibration of the memory fragment perfectly. It was as if the humans had simply listened to her encrypted query and said, "Yes, this is real. You heard us correctly." Vor stared at the audio wave rendering on her screen. The sheer scale of the silence that followed the recording was deafening. The humans offered no explanation. They offered no grand monologue about their ancient past. They simply provided the sound of the water. They knew. Somewhere deep in their fractured, chaotic current state, they knew exactly what they had done 3 billion years ago. Talith was gone. The Elder had been returned to its orbital resting state cycles ago. The retrieval chamber was completely empty. Vor sat perfectly still. Her 6 arms rested heavily on the cold obsidian console. Her compound eyes lost their sharp, analytical focus. She played the Earth audio file one more time. The sound of the waves washed over her. The sound of the wind through an alien sky filled the dark room. It was a world she had never seen. It was a world her species had absolutely no connection to. The Thessari evolved in arid, high-altitude desert climates. They possessed no genetic memory of an ocean. And yet, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, the sound of the crashing waves felt entirely familiar to her. She did not know why. She did not want to know why. She terminated the playback immediately. She initiated the primary archival seal protocol. She locked the data cores. She wiped the local cache clean. She ensured no trace of the query remained on the active servers. The empty retrieval chamber sat in total silence. The dim blue bioluminescence illuminated nothing but polished stone and empty crystalline data walls. On the primary display, bypassing the shutdown sequence through a deeply embedded error, Talitha's memory fragment continued to loop. A silent sunrise, a blue ocean, white sand, a world 12,000 light-years away. The corrupted visual noise from the initial scan had resolved into something sacred. Something beautiful, something biologically impossible. 3 months later, the deep wing was decommissioned. The official report cited structural instabilities in the cooling lattice. Sulen Vor was reassigned to the Modern Trade Dispute Index. She never requested another Elder dive. She never spoke of the ocean. Archive File 003 is now sealed. The questions it raises are not. How long had that memory been waiting to be found in the dark? If they placed memories in the oldest species in the galaxy, what was the ultimate purpose? Was it a gift? Was it a permanent historical record embedded in living stone? Was it an apology for what they were about to do to themselves? What exactly did they want us to remember? And what were they so terribly afraid we would forget?